Apart from the problems digital platforms create for workers, they present a bigger problem for society itself. Robert McChesney is a professor of communications at the University of Illinois and co-author of People Get Ready, The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy.
Uber is a classic example of exactly the sort of tension that the technology brings that is due to capitalism. Now, what the investors and owners of Uber are doing is trying to set up pretty much a global monopoly or duopoly for a ride system based on people using their own cars and just providing the algorithm to overall see it and make a profit off of it. And the idea eventually with Uber, and they don't really hide this, is they see eventually there will be driverless cars and they'll have a fleet of driverless cars that'll do this down the road. But in the meantime, they'll let people do it with their own vehicles and use their algorithm and their digital technology. Now, in a capitalist economy, this works well in one sense because it gives these people employment. But it also undermines existing public service taxi systems all over the world that serve the entire community and have obligations that Uber drivers don't have. And the drivers also sometimes have protections and standards of living that Uber drivers will rarely achieve. But the problem is that what happens when these are driverless vehicles that Uber launches on, puts out there? And in one sense, you could say that Uber as it is, or Uber with driverless vehicles, is a brilliant idea. I mean, if you have a city like Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver where you have terrible traffic congestion, what if no one actually owned their own car and you only had a fleet of driverless vehicles or the vehicles driven by Uber drivers that would pick you up and drop you off whenever you wanted, and you would just pay for that. But you wouldn't have to store a car. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or gasoline or pay for a car. It probably, especially if the vehicles were not fueled by oil, they'd probably be much better for society. There'd be hardly any traffic congestion by comparison. There'd be better for the environment, better for urban living. The problem for the economy, though, is under capitalism is twofold. I mean, it takes a big chunk of the economy out of play. You don't have as much of an automobile industry. You don't have a fossil fuel industry. And you don't have people driving vehicles if it's self-driven. So that's the number one job in the United States for men is driving a vehicle of one form or another. So it's going to create immense problems. And then there's also the issues if you're going to have like this algorithm like Uber has or Lyft, should a private company have a monopoly right and make killer profits off this? Shouldn't something like this be a public service? Shouldn't there be like a single-payer system? I mean, it shouldn't be like some gazillionaire just because they invented an algorithm. They get forever profits on it. They have private control over transportation. That's a public utility. This leads to fundamental political questions about who should control a transit system that basically is the heart blood of a society.
All this points to another problem. And it's a big one. Digital platforms tend to form global monopolies. Uber is now the fastest-growing corporation in the history of the world. Since its beginning in 2009, it's expanded to over 670 cities in 83 countries. Airbnb is in 191 countries and is rapidly knocking out its competitors. Amazon, Google, and Facebook are other champions in the winner-take-all digital economy.
You can't exaggerate the degree of monopoly in the digital phase of capitalism. I mean, the internet and the digital revolution has produced more monopoly in capitalism than anything else has ever done before. It's really astonishing. I haven't looked for like 2 or 3 weeks, but every month or so I look at the list of the most valuable companies in the U.S. economy based on market value, the number of shares they have times the share price. And the last time I looked, the top 3 companies and 5 of the top 8 were internet monopolies, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, formerly Google. 5 of the 8 most valuable companies. in the U.S. economy are these internet companies. They're all monopolies the way economists use the term monopoly, because once you have a certain percentage, you can control how much entrance there's in the market, what the price is. It's you are a monopoly. You have that much power. And all these companies have monopoly power over core franchises. And it's a function of how the digital economy works, with economies to scale, with network effects, that if you're the top search engine, in a case like Google, no one else can really compete with you at a certain point in time, because everyone uses you and you have a much better product. Or if you're the top social media like Facebook, no one's going to go to MySpace and for people to communicate with. If you want to do social media, you're going to use Facebook. They have 2 billion customers. Everyone on earth uses it. That's the only one. That's the only game in town, so to speak. And so the digital economy produces global monopolies. Now, is this a problem? Well, in traditional democratic theory, this is a irreconcilable problem. This is a cancer. It's been understood from the very beginning of democracy that if you have concentrated private economic power and monopoly, it's antithetical to having effective self-government. In the United States, it's the core of our tradition. And you look at the great political fights of the 19th and 20th century, they were on this very issue. How much power private monopolistic firms had. It led to the populist movement and progressive movements to break up the big firms, because it was understood that if you have monopolistic firms that dominate your economy, as these digital giants completely dominate the U.S. economy and the world economy today, it gives them inordinate power over elected governments. No matter how democratic the system, no matter how dutiful the system is in trying to limit corruption and the influence of big money, it's unavoidable when you've got firms that large, that powerful, controlling that much of the economy. They invariably get their way. And the only way you can maintain democracy ultimately is to either break up the firms or nationalize them.
Nationalizing corporations to avoid global monopolies may sound like a radical idea now, but we've done it before. We've had publicly owned railways and airlines, and we've made public utilities out of essential services like gas, electricity, and telecommunications. And as Robert McChesney says, the idea has had support from all over the political spectrum.
The idea that monopolistic firms are antithetical to democracy is not just a liberal, left-wing, populist, socialist, progressive idea. It's not just on the left wing of the spectrum. Henry Simons, who was Milton Friedman's mentor as an economist at the University of Chicago, a conservative free market economist who disliked labor unions, who opposed the New Deal and social spending by government, what we would call social democracy today. He believed in market economics and capitalism in his bone marrow. He famously did research that said, look, if you have monopolistic companies, the equivalent, like AT&T back in his day, or Standard Oil, or today the Googles and Microsofts and Apples and Amazons, these monopolistic companies are not just bad for democracy, they're bad for capitalism, because these companies make killer profits and choke out small entrepreneurs, small investors. The small business sector has to pay them more. They make capitalism inefficient and indefensible. And his argument was that it was imperative that governments break up these big companies, and if they can't be broken up, they should be nationalized and taken out of the market system altogether so they can't get in the way of other businesses. And I think he made a pretty compelling argument and one that's worth revisiting.